Hi, this is Mallory DeMott, and my presentation covers Chapter 6 of Part 2, and the essay is called The Possessive Investment of Whiteness. First, what is possessive investment of whiteness? This is a phrase coined by the author of the essay, George Lipsitz, and it means that historically, whites have taken measures to secure and maintain their possession of social power. In other words, they're invested in maintaining power over minorities, and they've taken action to protect that investment. This chapter begins by stating that there is a need for whites to be racially aware, and that this awareness can only come through an understanding of the events and practices that have guaranteed white power at the expense of minorities. So most of the time we think in terms of white people versus black people, but in reality it's often white people versus all minorities. Before black Africans were imported to America for slavery, the colonists tried using Native Americans as slaves. Logistics made this difficult to realistically do, which is why they turned to Africa, and the era of black slavery began. The colonials were afraid also that blacks and Native Americans might join together and rise up against them, so they made sure to keep the blacks and the Native Americans away from each other using threats and bribery. Once slavery was abolished, America turned to Asians for low-wage labor, even though in the past Asians had been unwelcome to American immigration. Eventually, Asian immigration was banned, so Americans turned to Mexico to find cheap labor. This is a photo of migrant Mexican workers being subjected to a group physical examination before they were allowed to enter the U.S. So clearly, along with taking advantage of cheap labor at the expense of minorities, white Americans have also had an unfortunate history of treating them inhumanely. I would venture to guess that when you talk to most white people about why blacks are at a disadvantage, they would mention slavery and segregation and leave it at that. However, injustices unrelated to slavery continued to be made even after the abolishment of segregation in 1960. These injustices were not only directed towards blacks, but to almost all non-white groups. So what are these injustices? They are mostly social policy decisions which have sought to help whites profit and have either ignored or purposefully excluded minorities. In 1935, agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from receiving Social Security benefits through the Social Security and Wagner Acts. I wanted to verify this, so I did some research and ended up on the official Social Security website, where it discusses the issue. The article confirmed that agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from care, and it also went out to point that a large percentage of these workers were African American. Some scholars believe that this was a deliberate move by policymakers to exclude people based on race. In 1934, the FHA was established and the National Housing Act was passed, which meant that now the federal government was backing home loans and that most people could access them, or so it seemed. What actually happened was something called redlining. Redlining is when an institution refuses a loan or insurance to someone because they live in an area deemed to be a high financial risk. At that time, properties were determined to be good or bad investments based on maps that banks created. And here are two examples of those maps. The one on the left is of Detroit and the one on the right is of Cleveland. The following quote is taken directly from Wikipedia, which says, "On the maps, the newest areas, those considered desirable for lending purposes, were outlined in green and known as Type A. These were typically affluent suburbs on the outskirts of cities. Type B neighborhoods, outlined in blue, were considered still desirable, whereas older Type C were labeled declining and outlined in yellow. And Type D neighborhoods were outlined in red and were considered the most risky for mortgage support. These neighborhoods tended to be in the older districts in the center of cities. Often they were also black neighborhoods. In summary, a disproportionate and large number of blacks and other minorities were faced with incredible barriers to obtaining a loan and being able to reap the benefits of home ownership, such as home equity and being able to pass property down to generations." I want to pause here and ask a couple of questions. The overall question regarding issue of redlining is whether or not it was a racist tactic. There are two sides to every story, and our book only really tells one side. Banks usually make their decisions according to what the numbers tell them and how much risk is involved. So, is it more or less risky for a bank to invest in newer homes in newer, safer neighborhoods or in older, more crowded, low income apartments? Which of these would they get the most money from? Later in this presentation, I'll talk about how white people usually had better jobs than minorities. And if that's the case, would a bank want to loan to someone with a good ability to repay the loan or someone whose reliability is unknown? I ask these questions because I want you to think about whether or not the banks were acting out of racism or were they simply making the best financial decision. Now there's a catch-22 in play. Why were the minorities poor? Why did they have lower paying, less reliable jobs? Why did they live in lower income areas? The answer? Because whites made it so. Here's a quote from the book which shows white people saying, "We can't give you a loan today because we've discriminated against members of your race so effectively in the past that you have not been able to accumulate any equity from housing and then pass it down through the generations." So back to our list of the injustices that minorities faced. Along with the home loan situation, realtors took advantage of minorities using a sales technique called blockbusting. This is when they would convince white people to sell their homes at a lower price. They did this by scaring the white people into believing that racial minorities would be moving into the neighborhood and lower the value of all the homes in the neighborhood. The white homeowners would then panic and sell their home for a lower price in order to get out. And the realtors would sell that home property at a much higher price to a minority family. Banks also sold their loans to minorities at a much higher interest rate than whites. With these two forces at work, minorities typically paid 15 to 25% more in housing costs compared to whites. So here are a few images of the blockbusting technique. On the left is an article written in 1960 titled "Confessions of a Blockbuster," written obviously by someone who participated in the blockbusting technique and kind of told everybody what he did with that. On the top right is a piece of propaganda saying, look at these homes now, an entire block ruined by Negro invasion. Every house marked X is now occupied by Negroes. And it says, save your home, vote for segregation. So there was clearly a desire for segregated housing back then. Down on the bottom, we have some protesters who are minorities, except for, it looks like, a white reverend participating in the protest, saying that real estate exploitation produces ghettos. With the Home Loan Act, white people took those loans and moved out to the suburbs. That left a high concentration of minorities in the city who became further disadvantaged by urban renewal projects. So instead of keeping low-income housing units, the government replaced them with government buildings, factories, offices, and highways. City officials also wanted to build a robust local economy, and they knew that they needed to attract large, successful businesses to do that. So they built luxurious housing and state-of-the-art museums, shopping centers, and other recreational facilities, hoping to appeal to the high-level executives of these businesses. To make way for all of these things, room had to be made, and many of the low-income housing buildings were removed. Even more housing was removed in order to create a literal physical buffer zone around these luxury facilities. Entire blocks were left empty in order to put some distance between places like shopping centers and the, quote, more dangerous, unquote, low-income areas. Minorities had to compete for what was left, and what was left was not only less desirable, but also physically detrimental. It was common practice for places like garbage dumps or incinerators to be built near minority communities. As of the 1990s, 75% of Houston's garbage incinerators and 100% of their garbage dumps were located in black neighborhoods. In addition, for those facilities who broke building codes, the penalties for them were up to 500 times less severe for facilities located in minority neighborhoods than for those in white neighborhoods. And this is true even after controlling for income. In 1988, there was a survey conducted which showed that significantly more black children than white children suffered from excess lead poisoning, or lead in their bloodstreams. And teenagers of a Navajo tribe showed a cancer prevalence that was 17 times higher than the typical white teenager because corporations like uranium mines have traditionally put their facilities near American Indian reservations. When it comes to employment, more whites than minorities have received lesser wages, less job security, fewer promotions, and fewer benefits, including retirement. Minorities are also more prone to layoffs. In 1974, minorities made up 10 to 12% of the workforce, but they accounted for 60 to 70% of layoffs. So it's safe to say that minorities have experienced significantly more stress related to their jobs than whites, who have been better protected by workers' unions and racial bias. The book also brings up drugs and crime. One thing that it mentioned that I found interesting was that black people are not typically the ones bringing drugs into the U.S., nor are they the ones selling it wholesale to distributors. When blacks are a part of the drug chain, they're usually the ones out on the streets dealing, doing the dangerous, dirty work of those higher up in the chain of command. Because blacks are out on the street, they are an easy target for police officers. They also usually can't afford attorneys to defend them if they get arrested. So for police officers who need to meet a certain quota, minorities are an easy to access and obvious target. I'm not saying that minorities are innocent for dealing drugs, but I will discuss a potential reason as to why they choose this lifestyle more than whites do. All of these reasons and more have helped whites to not only maintain their social power, but to gain and prosper at the expense of minorities. It's a vicious cycle, which led me to create this diagram of a vicious cycle. And so first, we have social policies which ensure fewer opportunities and more barriers for minorities, which leads to them experiencing and living a lesser quality lifestyle, which leads them to feeling a loss of hope, more frustration, and as I mentioned before, they may turn more often to crime, but more especially drug dealing because it's a lucrative, high-paying business. And that lifestyle leads to minorities being stereotyped as lazy, unreliable, dangerous, or racist towards whites for being frustrated at the system in which they find themselves. So these opinions are mostly due to ignorance on the matters I've mentioned, but this national opinion research report that was conducted in 1990 goes into more detail about the stereotypes that whites have about minorities. Here are some of the results that it found. The first is that more than 50% of U.S. whites viewed blacks as innately lazy and less intelligent and less patriotic than whites. More than 60% said that they believe that blacks suffer from poor housing and employment opportunities because of their own lack of willpower. 56% said that blacks preferred welfare to employment. And 44.6% contended that blacks tended towards laziness. George Lipsitz, the author of this essay we're talking about, he addresses white ignorance, and he includes a couple of verbatim comments from white teenagers. Here is one that is from a white high school senior, which says, "I feel we spend more time in my history class talking about what whites owe blacks than just about anything else when the issue of slavery comes up. I often receive dirty looks. This seems strange given that I wasn't even alive then, and the few members of my family from that time didn't have the luxury of owning much, let alone slaves. So why, I ask you, am I constantly made to feel guilty?" Now, I don't necessarily think this high school senior is wrong in his reasoning, given what the typical public school teaches or fails to teach regarding white privilege. In fact, up until now, I have shared this high schooler's opinion. These social policies came as a surprise to me. I didn't know about them until this class, and my eyes have definitely been opened. One thing that really bothered me from this chapter was when the author said that white people's opinions are almost never followed with a statement to the effect that, of course, some people's families did own slaves, and we will not rest until we track them down and make them pay reparations. So the author is saying that the best course of action is to make white people pay for what they've done to minorities. This is extremely frustrating to me because it's just the same problem, but in reverse. How often have we heard that we shouldn't build ourselves up by tearing someone else down? Yet this is what the author and others think should happen. Mr. Lipsitz was clearly picking on white American youth when he included their ignorant comments in his essay. But is it their fault for being ignorant? Or is it because U.S. public education focuses almost exclusively on slavery and the end of segregation, and then they call it good? There is a disturbing absence in the truth in mainstream American education. So how can we fault whites for being ignorant? With this in mind, I believe that the best solution for eradicating racism and fostering understanding is simply to include all the facts into mainstream education. History needs to stop being rewritten or censored just so that we can feel good about ourselves. And by we, I mean whites. It is only exacerbating the problem of white privilege when we choose to leave out crucial details. If we really want to see social change, the truth needs to come out. Who is to blame? If anyone, it's the government. It's not a black people problem. It's not a white people problem. The real issue here is poor American education and the intentional keeping of whites in the dark. Knowledge is power. We must fight for our right to be informed. We are also only as strong as our weakest link, so the more that we can help those around us understand the truth, the greater we will be for it. I'd like to end with a quote from Martin Luther King, Jr., which says, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." Once people understand more, I believe they will become more compassionate towards and willing to help minorities to improve their situation. I believe that policies like affirmative action try to do this, but backwards. This policy forces people to act compassionately without helping them understand the need for it. This only leads to frustration and anger. If we truly want to make a change, we must do as Martin Luther King suggests and drive out darkness or our ignorance with light or education and replace hateful actions with loving ones. That's my presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.